My name is Diane Koenker, and I'm the director of SSEES. And it's my privilege to welcome you to this evening's exploration of the consideration of the coming Russian election, SSEESing Putin. Ben Noble, the evening's organizer, will explain the format in just a minute. It's my pleasant task to introduce our distinguished panelists. And they are in alphabetical order. Nadia, who is editor-in-chief of the Calvert journal, an online magazine dedicated to the culture and creativity of Russia. Previously, she worked as the Moscow correspondent for The Independent, and she's written for The Guardian, Telegraph, and Reuters. Professor Mary Buckley is a fellow of Hughes Hall, University of Cambridge. Her most recent book, published by Cambridge University Press this January, is The Politics of Unfree Labor in Russia, Human Trafficking, and Labor Migration. Dr. Pete Duncan, who is a specialist in Russian foreign policy at SSEES. Dr. Sam Greene is director of the Russian Institute at King's College London and a specialist in Russian politics. He's the author of the book Moscow and Movement, Power and Opposition in Putin's Russia, published by Stanford University Press. Professor Bob Service is Emeritus Fellow of St. Anthony's College, Oxford, and formerly an academic staff member at SSEES. The most recent of his many books includes The Last of the Tsars, Nicholas II and the Russian Revolution, and he's currently working on a book on Russia in the Putin period. And Professor Andrew Wilson is Professor of Ukrainian Studies at SSEES, and he is an expert on the comparative politics of democratization in post-Soviet states. His most recent book is Ukraine in Crisis, What the West Needs to Know, published by Yale University Press. Before we begin, let me alert you that we plan to put on other SSEESing events in future terms, so please stay tuned to this space. Our primary goal is to show off what SSEES can do so well, using different disciplinary angles to analyze particular regional phenomena. Now I want to pass the mic to Ben Noble, who is lecturer in Russian politics at SSEES and convener of the post-Soviet press group. His research is on the lawmaking process and during the legislative stage of policymaking in authoritarian regimes, including, of course, Russia.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Diane. Good evening, everybody. It's great to see such a large crowd on a wet and cold Friday evening. As Diane said, I'm going to be chairing the event. Before I go through some of the details, just a few housekeeping points. The hashtag for this event is SSEESing. Please do tweet away, although of course we want you to concentrate on what people are saying in the room. Make sure to get the right number of S's and E's, and preferably in the right order. Those of you that are at Matthew will know that that's a recycled joke, but I plan on using it every time I speak in this room. And make sure that your electronic devices are turned off or in the silent mode. So this evening, we're not going to be discussing who's going to win the election, because we all know the answer. What we're going to be doing is discussing related issues, and hopefully we have people from different disciplines who will bring fresh, interesting, unexpected perspectives on this political event. Whether we call it an election, whether we call it something else, is up for debate. So we'll look at a range of topics. We'll begin with Pete Duncan. Pete will talk about the general political context in Russia at the moment, so setting the scene for a discussion of the election. Mary Buckley will then look at the nature of the Russian state, its history and its present, possibly its future, as well as looking at the general topic of mobilization in Russia. Then we'll move on to Sam Greene. Sam will talk about recent research that he's done on political preferences in Russia, both for and against Putin. Then we'll move on to Nadia's contribution. Nadia will look at the role of young people and how they are relating to the forthcoming election. We'll then move on to Andy's contribution. Andy will talk about dramaturgia. Those of you that are interested in his contribution, I'm sure you all will be able to read about it in more detail on an article that's just been posted on Open Democracy Russia website. Yeah. Finally, last but not least, Professor Robert Service will ask whether Putin has found a new role as a lord of misrule.
So I'm going to say, first of all, as Ben said, all this is about the general context of the election. First of all, why there is an election. Secondly, the context of repression in which it's taking place. And thirdly, if Putin is not going to be removed by election, how may Putin how may the Putin regime, or Putin's rule at least, come to an end. So why are they elections, given that we know who is going to win? It's an authoritarian regime in the sense that the regime in the Kremlin has control over all the major forms of media, control over all the political parties that are allowed to get into the State Duma, and also major influences over the others that aren't. The Kremlin decides who is allowed to stand for president, which parties are allowed to stand for the State Duma. So no real opposition is allowed. Alexei Navalny, who is the real opposition in this election, he not only is he not allowed to stand, but as a form of additional pressure, his brother has been sent to prison for 4 years, effectively the regime taking his brother hostage to try and get Navalny to moderate his behaviour. And Boris Nemtsov, of course, who also was a real opponent of the regime, killed just outside the Kremlin 3 years ago now. And these elections are fraudulent. We've seen the nature of the fraud very clearly in the last but one State Duma elections in 2011, when the regime was quite taken by surprise by the amount of protest, both at the regime itself and at the stealing of the elections. It's taken measures since then to try and ensure that there won't be similar protests after this election, which I will come to the section of the question in a minute. It's a kleptocratic regime. It steals. Putin and his friends steal from the state. Putin's friends get all the major state contracts now, building the bridge from mainland Russia to the Crimea, the Sochi Olympics, the construction there. They go to to people who Putin has known since he was a boy in Leningrad. So Putin has to stay in power. If he doesn't stay in power, he'll face criminal charges, not just for stealing, but possibly for the murders which have been committed while he's been president. And unlike Yeltsin, you remember that Yeltsin was looking for a successor who would give him immunity for all his crimes, and Putin did that. But Putin can't get immunity from anyone else, because while Yeltsin could be sure and could believe that Putin would stay in power for a significant number of years, while Yeltsin would be until Yeltsin died, Putin can't rely on anyone to do that for him, given the state of the Russian economy. Change is going to happen. And so when he did briefly leave the presidency for 4 years in 2008, he made sure it went to somebody who did not have his own power base, Medvedev, who would then, if Medvedev looked like he was losing control or getting too much power, Putin would still be able to return and reassert himself. Putin, of course, will easily win, as Ben has said, not as much as the official results will say, that he'll, even without fiddling, he would still get 50%. But to make, the reason they're having these elections is to get some sort of legitimacy along the lines of the narrative that they've been putting forward. Putin's been putting forward ever since he became Prime Minister that Russia is a democracy. The fear is of low turnout. And so that is why people like Ksenia Sobchak have been allowed to stand to try and get some kind of election interest. And this is the first unexpected thing from my point of view, that Sobchak has been allowed to make such damning criticisms of the regime, saying that Putin decides who's allowed to stand. In other words, even on television, able to say that this isn't a democracy, this is a farce. Now, the context of repression we see, and this repression affecting all sectors of society and arguably outside the society, a context of the consequence of Putin's fears of more protests. In the cultural sphere, we've seen the continuing arrest of Kirill Serebrennikov, the head of the Gogol Center. The impression, the attempt is to show to people in Russia that nobody is safe. Minister of Economic Development, Alexei Lukayev, sent to prison 8 years, supposedly accepting a bribe, fabricated charges. Governor of Kirov region, Bielik, somebody who was clearly part of the state apparatus, and he's been sentenced to prison for 8 years as well. Governor of Sakhalin, 13 years. Nobody is safe. And what we saw in the address to the Federal Assembly last week, Putin's threatening the world. Weapons can reach everywhere. Of course they can't, it's a bluff. But they're coming out against the New START treaty that Medvedev had conducted. And then, the next, certainly unexpected to me, I wasn't expecting Sergei Skripal and his daughter to suffer a murder attempt. It's very serious for their health. And the background, of course, is that in 2010, Medvedev had pardoned him at the time that he was swapped. But Putin, at the same time, as soon as when Skripal was allowed to come to London, he said openly that traitors will kick the bucket. And Russian Channel 1 on Wednesday night was saying that Britain is a dangerous place for terrorists, threatening people inside Britain. So they're no longer just threatening people inside Russia, now threatening people around the world with weapons, and inside Britain in particular. And I'd make the point that all these moves that I've mentioned can also be seen to be moves by Putin against Medvedev, against his own prime minister. Ulyukayev was a minister in Medvedev's government. Bielik was appointed by, the governor of Kirov, was appointed by Medvedev in 2010 against Putin's wishes. He was part of the Union of Right Forces. The New START was signed by Medvedev. And of course, Skripal, the person who's now fighting for his life in a coma, was pardoned by Medvedev. So what we're seeing is actually not just the fear that Putin has of the society as a whole, of the world outside, but even wanting to remove opposition from his own prime minister. So how will Putin's regime end? The most unexpected thing to me would be, the third unexpected point, was that he would die in office. This is actually the normal way for most of the time. Lenin, Stalin, Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko, the Tsars, of course, generally, simply died in office. This is the least likely. He's only 65. He can live, as Berlusconi has shown, he has the best possible health treatment for another 20 years. Russia's not going to tolerate him for that long. The next possibility is that he might be overthrown by revolution from below, by the accumulation of economic problems leading to the unrest of one sort or another. Actually, despite what we think, having commemorated the revolution last year, revolution is actually quite rare in Russia. Even what we call the Revolution 1905 didn't actually change the government. 1 minute, thank you. Didn't change the government. But there is a real fear of revolution nonetheless, having what's been seen in Ukraine, the Orange Revolution, the Maidan in 2013-2014. War is more likely, I think, to be a cause of revolution than economic problems. So the more likely way in which the Putin's rule will end, I would say, this is my final point, is by being overthrown by his colleagues, that is the Khrushchev model or the Gorbachev model in the sense of the August Putsch actually giving the power ultimately to Yeltsin. But in any way, the overthrow by his colleagues who will see that they have to change, they cannot go on as they are with the existing system, with its over-dependence on oil and gas, with the hostility with the West. And they'll be looking for somebody who can implement the reforms, who can save the regime, can save their own property, and at the same time remove the sanctions that they hate, and generally improve international relations. Thank you, Ben. Thank you very much.
Well, Ben asked me to pick out 3 surprises, so I'm going to begin with those, talk about a couple of narratives around them, and then go on to look at how the state hopes to mobilise the electorate linked to the turnout. I was surprised when Ksenia Sobchak announced her candidacy. She would know, of course, that her rating was going to be very low. There was no chance she could win. One narrative is indeed that the Kremlin is happy with this because it makes it look vaguely like a competition. She, of course, insists that that is not the case and that she's in this for the long run. This is her political launch. So there are two narratives there on the significance of this. Many have criticised her. It's just a show. Jawlensky made that in the debate on the 5th of March. It's interesting that Nezavisima Gazeta on the 22nd of February, one of her team said that, well, actually, she's got her eye on the governorship of St. Petersburg, Georgy Potavchenko's post. Now, Sobchak never admitted that, but she did say it was really time for him to go and that Petersburg needed a more energised politics. And then what was interesting, in Argumenti Facti, on the 6th of March, when she was in Samara, she indicated that she quite liked to run for the governorship there. So, lots of hints about, give me something better than this. So she's packaging herself, she's mobilising herself, and claims it's a serious political launch. Well, she'd really need to up her game because her percentage, obviously, as you all know, is very low. And one of those polls, which asks the population, who is the candidate, is there one that you definitely would not vote for? And she got the highest of 90%. Next was Jawlensky on 82%. There was another one of who do you relate to negatively, more general, not necessarily linked to the vote. And she was at the top of that, this time 57%. Surprise two was Zyuganov not being chosen and Greene in as candidate. I think that was a surprise to Zyuganov as well. Very smart move initially on the Communist Party to pick a younger and seemingly much more dynamic man. Black PR follows about those bank accounts and the gold. Very loud black PR. One night on Channel 1, which I have watched all week, indeed for the last fortnight, one newsreader saying to listeners, would you really vote for someone who has property links in Latvia, a NATO country, and bank accounts elsewhere? There were lots of rumours swirling in the election, and this is always the most fascinating thing about me for Russia, the rumours. The trouble is I'm here, not there, so most of them I'm not listening to or hearing. But the one that's in the press is being put out that the estimate of his 7.5% vote is really far too low. The rumour has he's on 15%. Of course, he'd like 15%. It was Dmitry Orlov on Vesti, this was the 28th of February, really said, look, Greene has great potential. He's unexpected, and Zyuganov was getting inert and stale. However, he argued that 50% of voters don't actually know he's running. Many still think it's Zyuganov. The other was an interesting article by the editor of Nezavisima Gazeta, arguing that, smart people, political operators, really think through the consequences of their actions. So the implication being not declaring foreign bank accounts was not particularly politically astute. Okay, surprise three for me were two of Putin's performances. Now, much of that address, 2 hours of it, which I watched live, to the Federal Assembly and everyone in Manege, was reasonably predictable. We knew also in advance that there would be screens. I was expecting bar graphs and statistics about economics and social policy. But really, when the globe came up with the weapons swirling both ways around the world, it was quite mesmerising, and I was surprised at that. And Putin looked as though he really loved this, really liked this point. And the people in the front rows were all smiling, and you could see this was making an impression. Why was this then? What were the messages? I think there were different messages going different ways. Internally, we're great. It's the great message. We're strong. It's, Velika Держава showing itself in weaponry. Of course, some people wouldn't like it, those that are a little apprehensive about militarization. But many people buy into this narrative. And to the West, you haven't been listening. It's the old important thing about wanting respect. Russian leaders have always wanted respect from the West. They've never felt, or sometimes they might feel they get some of it, but that gets replayed historically. Now, there was an interesting piece in Nezavisima Gazeta, again by the editor, he had a hypothesis about this, and his hypothesis was maybe that what he was trying to do was speak over the head almost of everyone in the world to get the American people to mobilize and actually put pressure on Trump to come and talk. But he stressed that that was a hypothesis only, just one other narrative in the swirl of all the election narratives. Another surprise for me regarding Putin, but I could be out of line on this, because I know he used the Luzhniki in the last election. When he had that event at the Luzhniki, which initially it was meant to be, I think, 80,000 people, which then in a later report was 130,000 people. It wasn't surprising when he came in on that red carpet. We often see him doing that in Kremlin settings. What struck me was the use of call and response. And maybe he has done this before, but it was when he was saying, you know, we are a team. And then he said, da, and the chorus was back, da. And I thought, has he done this before? And to what extent is he looking at Trump for his use of the crowd? But again, I could be wrong on that, but it seemed a bigger populist echo than before. Those were my surprises. What do I want to say about mobilizing very quickly? And it links to what Pete said about turnout. Well, first, I think it's really worth mentioning, don't forget the Russian state as part, or the Russian Republic as part of the Soviet Union was always mobilizing its people. Whether it was May Day, the anniversary of the revolution, citizens' voluntary detachments, Subotniki, you know, any campaign was mobilized. And those mechanisms can carry over, but they can be refined, they can be redefined, they can be restructured in new settings. So let's have a quick look at this. It was commissant on the 27th of February, if you want to look at the article, when the presidential administration apparently informed the deputy governors that they wanted over 70% turnout. This was desirable, something comparable to what Dmitry Medvedev got in 2008, on an average across the country. Of course, it will vary. The same article said that for Crimea they wanted over 80%. And don't forget, previous elections, here we go back to 2008, 2011, there was an initiative apparently for Yedinaya Rossiya of Adin plus 10, 1 plus 10. You take yourself along to the polling station and 10 others. This has been updated at different levels. So some people have to bring 20, some at district level are advised to bring along 30 voters, higher up 50 voters. Now, various competitions are taking place around voting. Channel 1 on the 2nd of March reported that there was a competition in one local area which asked people what comfortable surroundings they would like. How could they improve the environment? Would citizens like a square, fountains, or sports facilities? This is mobilising local involvement. So come along on polling day, vote for what you want in your surroundings when you vote in the election. Then there are election day selfie contests. To participate, you turn up at the polling station, take a selfie next to a special sign, and post it on social media. Now, obviously this is very much catering to the younger generation. There's one poll which shows particular concern. The poll of 24th, 25th February, I have 1 minute, showed that while 48% of 18 to 30-year-olds said they would vote, that's a huge contrast with the over 60s, which was 81%. I'll have one more example, then I'll sit down. Commissant, I like this example. Commissant on the 1st of March reported that any young voter will be able to have free entrance to one of 3 pop concerts, which were currently being planned. Now, they hadn't signed the deal when this article came out, but the message is, go and vote, get your flyer, pick your concert. It's Black Star is one of the bands. The cost of, funding this, you've got to hire the place it's going to be in, pay the people that deal with lighting and the huge numbers, but the pop group will do this for free. So, targeting people. I haven't said much about the state, but really that is the state in action.
Thank you very much. Right, not very good at taking instruction. So when it comes to 3 surprising things, I was struggling to figure out what 3 surprising things I wanted to say and limit it to 3. Maybe nothing I'm going to say is surprising, but my hope is that I will say a number of things and you will find at least 3 of them surprising. That was not one of them, but I'll take it. So if I didn't want to surprise you, what I would probably have done is come in and quote some interviews that I've been conducting over the last couple of months and start by quoting from Maxim, who's 34 years old, is a textile designer, works in St. Petersburg, and he would tell you that he is absolutely thrilled with Putin. Of course, he's head over heels about the foreign policy, but also thinks that the economy is on the rails. It, of course, is being sabotaged by various government ministers who really should be taken out. He says not shot, but, and this is a quote, right, but to work at least on the next iteration of Belamur Canal, or something like that, right? That Navalny, but also Grunin, both, he's well aware of both of them, clearly work for the State Department and so on and so forth. He also actually thinks that Konstantin Ernst and others running the major television channels work for the State Department. So there's a conversation to be had there. But that would not be the surprising sort of set of quotes and interviews to talk about. So instead, talk about 2 other people that we spoke to recently. One is Yuri. He's 55 years old and sort of a middle manager, lives in Moscow, but originally from West Siberia. And one of the things that I've been trying to talk to people about in Russia is the social aspect of politics. Right? As you know, political scientists aren't very good at getting things right, particularly when it comes to politics. And so, one of the reasons for that is we tend to make assumptions about politics as an individual level phenomenon, right? We fall into this game of treating people as rational, utility maximizing individuals, right? And we, of course, are the attempt to be rational individuals, but we exist in social surroundings, right? And when people think about politics, interact with politics in Russia as anywhere else, they are intuitively and continually reading their social surroundings, right? So one of the questions that we asked Yuri was how many people he thinks in the country, right, share his political views. Obviously, it's a subjective thing, right? But he says the following: I think that my views are probably like most people. I'd say probably 90% of people in the country are dissatisfied with velocity, right? With the authorities, right? Just to clarify, right? 90% of people you think like you. Yes, exactly, and not 10%. No, I'm talking about where I'm from, in Siberia. I'm not talking about in Moscow. In Moscow, everybody's happy with Putin. Everybody's happy with the government because Moscow is being fed. Moscow is being mollycoddled, but they're taking everything from out there, right? From the rest of the country. People come here to make money. They're pulling money out of the budget. But out there in the country, in Russia, everybody is, or people are really destitute. And that, of course, is why they're not happy with the government. Asked another question. Very typical question, what we call the next Sunday question. If the presidential election were next Sunday, which it almost is at this point, who would you vote for? Right? And he said, well, I'm kind of nostalgic about the Soviet era, so I would probably vote for the communists. I think that people lived a lot better back then. Right? Okay, but we're talking about the presidential election, so which candidate would you vote for? Well, for Zyuganov. Right? Okay, you said you'd vote for Zyuganov, but of course Zyuganov isn't on the ballot, so who would you vote for? Oh yeah, I heard there's this other guy, but he's got some kind of connection, some kind of bank accounts. Okay, so if you have to pick from these candidates, well then, yeah, I just don't see anybody else. I probably have to vote for Putin. So let's take Marina, right? Marina is 30 years old, lives in Yaroslavl, works in retail. Same question, the next Sunday question. Who would you vote for? I would vote, she says, for whoever's in second place after Putin. Who's that going to be? I don't know. I'd have to look and see on the day. Well, okay, you know some of the names, right? Who's running? Well, I only really know Navalny, but he, you know, he was canceled. She says he won't. So okay, Navalny is not going to be who else? Well, Ksenia Sobchak, I'm not going to say anything about her. Zhirinovsky, again, just naming names, right? Okay, well, if it's Zhirinovsky, would you vote for him? I'm telling you, I would just look and see whoever's in second place in the polls on the day, and that's who I would vote for. Well, it's quite likely that'll be Zhirinovsky. Then I would vote for Zhirinovsky. Okay, can you explain why, how you came to this principle of voting for the second person in second place after Putin? She says, well, it seems to me that Putin's going to win anyway, right? And in fact, out of all the candidates, I would probably support Putin. But the thing is that if there was some maximum turnout, that united Russia would feel that there is somebody else on the stage other than just them. Right? I think that in order to have healthy authorities, we all struggle translating that word, you need to have a healthy opposition and healthy competition. As much as we tend to think, and if you read the press on a daily basis and you look at the Luzhniki rally, that the Maxims of the world, right, are the core constituency, and certainly Putin would like that to be his core constituency. Right? Most, I think, of the votes he's going to get are going to come from people like Yuri and Marina. Putin will win on the 18th of March, going out on a little bit of a limb, because he is genuinely popular, but we need to understand what that popularity means, right? Putin's popularity is based on the role that he plays as the galvanizing symbol of a political community that is socially and emotionally valuable to people, right? This was not always the case. Putin has been in power for quite a long time and has gone through several different iterations of legitimizing strategies. He happened upon this almost by accident after the rally around the flag effect that Crimea produced, right? But it has worked. As public trust in almost every political institution, from mayors to governors on up to the government and the prime minister, has deteriorated, as we've had 4 years of declining standards of living, declining real incomes, right? His ratings, his approval ratings, and his support have become detached from that. Right? And it is embedded clearly through interviews that we've been doing and polls in people's sense of being part of a political community that is meaningful to them, ideologically, ethnically to a certain extent, but certainly emotionally. Of course, that's not the only thing that's potentially meaningful to people, and it's worth noting that in this context, Putin's popularity is clearly not based on any evaluation of material benefit. It's not that people aren't aware that they're materially worse off than they were before. People, in fact, believe the country will continue to get worse off, even if they believe that they personally will prosper. People do not expect Putin to make their lives better. The politics is not built around that structure of expectations. Right? Very briefly, to wrap up, as in many cases, people live as in many countries around the world, people tend in Russia to live in bubbles. Right? Most people share the beliefs and values of those around them. But few people think that more than half of the country as a whole share their beliefs and values, including on politics and on Putin. So even Putin supporters, despite the fact that we are told and they are told that 86% of the country supports Putin, Putin supporters are, if anything, in our polling and our interviews, more likely than opposition supporters to think that they're in the minority. Right? The protest potential as a result, if we want to think about things other than elections that might affect Putin, depends less on what's outside the bubbles and more on what's inside them, on the sense of emotion, on the sense of connectedness, on the sense of threat, and the sense of expectation. People will be, again, reading their social surroundings, reading the surroundings outside their bubbles, and trying to decide what's happening to the symbols that are emotionally important to them. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
So before I start talking about the youth question, I'd like to talk a little bit about the cultural environment in Russia at the moment and set the scene for today's cultural landscape.
So especially since 2014, with the beginning of the war in eastern Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea, the crackdown on dissenters in the arts has been pretty unforgiving in Russia. This crackdown extended from independent media to cultural figures, and especially in 2014, a rather unpleasant Stalin-era phrase, the fifth column, returned to Putin's rhetoric and those in the Kremlin who were trying to curry favour with the president. This term was used to describe those who were critical of Russia's policy in Ukraine. So being against Russia's position on Ukraine became synonymous with being an enemy of the state. There were occasions where very large banners were hung from buildings where they had the face and the name of a dissenter and with the phrase or the term fifth column underneath it. And this was actually held, suspended a couple of times on the building just opposite the Ministry of Culture in Moscow. So that was pretty unpleasant. The space within which culture has been allowed to operate has shrunk and shrunk. And the most recent notable and I think very scandalous expression of this was the arrest of the very talented and progressive theatre director Kirill Serebrennikov, which I think somebody has already mentioned, who has been accused of embezzlement, which is complete rubbish. And his work has included the much talked about ballet Nadia, about the gay Soviet ballet dancer, which was actually pulled just before it was due to open at the Bolshoi, but it finally opened a couple of months ago. So this doesn't have a direct link to the election that's happening this month, but I think it's very important. This particular event with Serebrennikov is very important to note because it really does reflect and encapsulate the cultural landscape in Russia today. So to go back a couple more years to 2012, there was a marked cultural response to the election. When Putin announced that he would be running again for president for the third time, protests swept the country. It was early in 2012 when Pussy Riot performed their very infamous punk prayer in the Church of Christ the Saviour in Moscow, which famously led to two of the women being arrested and receiving prison sentences. This tradition of activist art was taken up by another very notable figure, which I'm sure many of you have heard about, and that's Piotr Pawlenski, whose several performances famously include nailing his scrotum to the cobbles of the Red Square in Moscow. And in response to Pussy Riot's arrests, he sewed his lips shut and stood outside the Kazan Cathedral in St. Petersburg. During and leading up to the election in 2012, there was a tradition of pretty outrageous activist art, which became very strong mainly because of the progenitors of Pussy Riot, the St. Petersburg-based group Weimar. This form of art has evaporated somewhat in recent years. I think that a lot of the performers that I've mentioned no longer really do what they did. Pussy Riot apparently still exists, but when they do perform, it's in a very different form. Their work is directed to different foes, so it's police brutality in the US, for example, rather than Putin, and their videos are very highly produced, slick films. And Pawlenski now lives in Paris, and it looks like the fact that he's sort of left Russia, that his work has become a lot less potent. So this is some context for the last election, but I did want to say that this time round, by comparison, there has been markedly little cultural backlash. I'm reluctant to put this down to the tightening grip on the cultural world in Russia because, as we've seen in the past, during Stalin's era, for example, when things were a lot more oppressive than they are now, that gave rise to some pretty incredible and enduring art. There is, I think, a real fatigue with the political infrastructure in the country, and the fact that this is the fourth time Putin is running an election, of course. A lot of young people, a lot of cultural figures are pretty fed up and I think a bit tired. So this kind of activist art has really died down, and as of yet there isn't really a strong oppositionist or radical tradition that has characterised the art scene in Russia today. A friend of mine, the Russian street artist Timofey Nadia, who is known for often thought-provoking and biting critiques of Russia today, when I asked him whether he was planning to do something in response to Putin running in this election, he said that doing something would mean legitimising the election, so he actually wouldn't bother doing anything at all. So to go on to the youth question, so this is very interesting and one I think a question that needs unpacking quite a bit. There is the idea that there is a Russian youth, a single homogenous entity, but in fact there isn't, and I think the media response to the protest last March were a little bit misleading. There were lots of young people that went out and protest, but the idea that the majority of the youth across Russia are fed up with Putin, they hate him and they want to overthrow him, I think was overstating the facts. By the way, when I'm talking about young people, I'm talking really 18 to 25. And this is a generation who's known no other president apart from Putin. So there are lots of young people, or there are some young people who work, for example, in Navalny's campaign, and they're very anti-Putin, and there are lots of young people who are also part of, or pay to be part of, the pro-Kremlin youth group, Nashi. I would actually say that a lot of young people across Russia do support Putin, but I wouldn't say they actively support him. I'd actually say that they passively support him. And the fact is that by comparison with earlier periods, the periods which their parents lived through, for example, to them they're experiencing unprecedented freedom to access the internet, freedom to material wealth. And it's important to note that their support of Putin isn't because they've been taken in by the kind of jingoistic rhetoric of state TV, because young people don't watch state TV. They get their news and information from the internet, and for that reason actually Putin and his cronies are pretty cut off from communicating with younger people. But unlike older people who might be dedicated watchers of state TV and they sort of hate the West and believe the Kremlin narrative that the West is out to undermine Russia, a lot of young people who do passively support Putin don't necessarily hate everyone in the West or in America. And that's because they inhabit a common cultural space as they're on the internet with their American peers. One thing that's apparent, I think, when you're working as a journalist in Russia is that when you're talking to people who are slightly older, say in their 40s or older, there's always some cataclysmic event which defined their younger years. Either it's the Afghanistan war, maybe it was the wars in Chechnya, maybe it was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And if you go further back, you might meet people who survived the Gulag. It's a history, it's a recent history that's filled with trauma. But when you speak to younger Russians, the sense is actually very different. There hasn't been a single political or societal event which has overturned their sense of self or their sense of belonging to Russia. Their parents' stories of growing up in the Soviet Union and having it crumble around them, losing their job as an engineer or a professor to try and make some money selling illegally imported clothes in a market, that's actually a really traumatic thing to hear. And by comparison, Russia today is stable. And it's this notion of stability, however subjective or indeed false that is, which forms the bedrock of, I think, of Putin's rule. So when you've heard stories from your parents about queuing at the shop for hours to try and get bread or losing your career and social standing practically overnight when the Soviet Union collapsed, when Putin says it's either me or revolution, you're going to go with the devil that you know. And if we're going to begin to talk a little bit about I will talk a little bit about it because I've got 1 minute left. If we're going to talk a little bit about those who are a bit older, so people who are between 25 and 35 living in urban centres, and by and large they're more sceptical of Putin. Many of them would have been out protesting on Bolotnaya in 2011, 2012. In the wake of that, it was a government decision to try and placate this emerging young middle class by redeveloping public spaces and making it very easy for them to rent property so they can set up hipster coffee joints and pop up food stalls, etc. And so by and large that might have worked, but also it's that young people are reluctant to protest or frightened to protest because finally they've actually got something to lose. And so the last thing I'd like to say is that I think a lot of young people, they obviously know what what the election this month will bring, but they're actually looking towards 2014. And I think that'll be really exciting once they've all grown up to see how they respond to, if Putin's still alive, a president who will not relinquish power. So thank you.
So The Rise and Fall of Dramaturgia is my title. This isn't obviously a real election, not in the normal sense of choice and an uncertain outcome. It isn't really a normal Russian election either. And it isn't even a real coronation, despite the popularity of that metaphor. If it was a real coronation, you'd have more elite fealty and a bit of bread and circuses for the ordinary folk. We don't really have that. And of these, it's the kind of second point that's most interesting. And so that's my first big point. This isn't a normal Russian election. because it isn't really about anything. Putin has no manifesto, he hasn't written all the articles in the press that he did in 2012. There's no grand narrative. There's not what Russians call dramaturgia, which means something a little bit more than drama. It means artificial, carefully scripted drama. And traditionally, this was the central meaning of Russian elections, is what they were all about. There have been a few mini dramas. People have talked about Sobchak and Buckley. There's been a little bit of sabre rattling. There's been a few false starts. It looked like at the beginning that the Kremlin was toying with a kind of victory campaign. Peace was declared in Syria several times. There were even overtures about a peace deal in Ukraine, but that proved impossible to deliver or even to stage. So you don't really have the election being about much. Traditionally, dramaturgia dominated, and it's been through many iterations. In the 90s, it was about distraction. Yeltsin versus the communists, Putin versus the Chechens. Then it became, under sort of mature Putinism, about creating the so-called Putin majority, the kind of dominant narrative that structured that. It was also a way of creating a kind of virtual chorus of elite loyalty. People had to pay lip service, at least, to the dominant narrative. And increasingly it became a kind of justification for fortress Russia. The political technologists who were in charge of creating this dramaturgia have all read far too much Carl Schmitt for anybody who's good. So this creating of an external enemy, the partisan, the state of exception, that was increasingly what Russia looked like, particularly from 2012 onwards. So second point, why is this election so dull? We don't know whether it's for short-term or longer-term reasons, whether it's just a pause in kind of narrative creation or it's more of a strategic recalculation. It might be because of blowback, the real-world consequences of some of these dramas. It might be because the Kremlin has become increasingly concerned about too much mobilization. It wants people to be loyal, but it doesn't want them to get too excited. It might be because the overemphasis on the virtual means the neglect of the real. Putin's speech the other week was kind of notable for some of the prosaic things he said. He talked a lot about development, not drama. The things that should have been done that haven't been done, the kind of practical economic tasks. It might be because of what Mark Galeotti has called fantasy fatigue, that you need higher and higher doses of drama and narrative to kind of keep people loyal. And it might just be wear and tear, that the propaganda machine isn't as efficient as it used to be. Certainly the guy in charge, Kirienko, is much more of a managerial figure than his predecessors. We don't know why this is happening. We can't predict the consequences for the next 6 years in full. But as a final third point, we can go back to the first point. If dramaturgia had the various functions that it did in the 90s and the noughties, then without it, then firstly, obviously, the population is much more passive. It's much more of a spectator for whatever Putin decides to do next. The most obvious symptom of that will be very low real turnout at the election itself. But more generally, people will be somewhat disengaged. Secondly, the virtual chorus will dissipate. Clans will compete, if not yet for actual power, but to control the narrative. You might have a new time of troubles, not with lots of false Dimitris, but sort of competing narratives as a cover for sort of planned politics. There'll be some nationalists, there'll be some liberals, there'll be sort of narrative anarchy even. There may well finally be relatively prosaic reasons why this is happening. It could be the World Cup, with Russia on its best behaviour until that finishes. It may be that Putin just wants a free hand in a very uncertain next term, but he's unlikely to get it, having failed to determine a script in advance.
Great, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be back to the, it used to be called the Soviet Press Study Group, and is now the Russian Press Study Group. Thanks for asking me. The title that Ben mentioned, Lord of Misrule, is a talk I'm giving next week, not tonight. I thought I'd concentrate on the elections. And from everything that's been said so far, I think it is important to bear in mind that these elections are extremely important. There hasn't been a Russian election since 1991. The last one was in 1991, when the leading candidate didn't offer an electoral bribe to the electorate. Back in 1991, when Boris Yeltsin won the election, he offered a set of policies that didn't guarantee immediate material satisfaction to the electorate. It offered decommunisation. In subsequent elections, in election after election, the leading candidate, who's guaranteed, more or less guaranteed, victory, offers a bribe to sections of the electorate. In that sense, then, these elections are part of the real political world. And Putin is not so self-confident as to think he doesn't have to do it even this time. If you look at the address that he gave on to the Federal Assembly just a few days ago, one of the things he made emphatically as an offer was that he was going to raise the minimum wage. So he does want to get people to those polling booths to vote for him. And the other point to be borne in mind is that it's not just what happens before elections, it's also the knowledge of what can happen after elections. If there's abundant and visible fraud, then there could be a situation such as happened at the end of 2011 when there were public protests. And I'll come back to that in a moment. Even coronations can be dangerous. I'm sure you all remember, because you were all there, 1895. It was one of the most dangerous moments in the later years of the Romanov monarchy, when a massive popular trampling of the crowds surrounding Nicholas II was tragically killed by its own stampede. So even coronations can be very, very tricky events in authoritarian regimes. And if these elections weren't important, why then in 2000 did Lushkov and Primakov have to be knocked aside so that they didn't stand against Putin? Why in a subsequent election did Kasyanov, Putin's own ex-prime minister, have to be knocked aside? Why does Navalny's brother have to languish in prison now, as people say, if elections don't matter? In order to get that legitimacy, something has to be done. It even had to be done in the Soviet period. To have some sense of legitimacy, you have to have elections, and they have to proceed in some sort of way with a semblance of relation to reality. The question that arises from all this is how free is Putin? And our press commentary, our media commentary in this country and in other Western countries almost always takes it as a premise that this man is a dictator, that he can do whatever he likes. But if you look at the history of the 20th century, even Stalin was constrained by the nature of the system. He was the jailer of the system, but he was also imprisoned himself by the system. He couldn't break free very easily from the system which he had set up. Increasingly, from the fall of communism onwards, the ruler, the president, has moved to a more nationalist perspective, nationalist program, in order to secure the favour of the Russian people. This happened after 1993, when Yeltsin had a tremendous shock because of the electorate's response to his chosen favourite, Gaidar's very poor showing. Increasingly after that, he moved towards a more nationalist agenda, and now we basically have a nationalist government in power in Russia. Putin doesn't use the word nationalism, but he is a nationalist, and the group around him bark even more loudly in nationalist tones than he does himself. He, after all, is the one who has to meet Merkel. He has to talk to Trump. He has to meet political leaders. So it's the others, the group around him, who are allowed to be rude. And they are extraordinarily crude in what they say about America. They have an absolute obsession with the dastardly nature of the American administration. So this is a group that hems Putin in. He's responsible for the nationalisation of public discourse in the Russian Federation, but now he's imprisoned by it. And one thing he's particularly imprisoned by, as Nicholas II was before 1917, and Stalin was, and Khrushchev was, he has to always win militarily. The great rationale for the Romanov monarchy was the guarantee that Russian armies would always win their wars, that Russian might would be appreciated and feared in Europe and then latterly around the world. Now, having gone for this agenda, Putin cannot afford a reversal. He's in a very difficult position then in terms of guaranteeing his own military success, but he's also in a difficult position because of the social contract that, following Yeltsin, he undertook to respect with his own electorate. The welfare state that Boris Yeltsin inherited from communism was only very gradually disassembled, and then not completely. And it still hasn't been completely disassembled, to the extent that whoever is president has to be seen to be working for the common weal and to be producing results. With sanctions and the turn of the oil price, this is much more dangerous situation than it ever was before. And as I think Russia enters its economic strategic cul-de-sac, and has been doing by virtue of its failure to diversify its economy, not that that's an easy thing to do. Look at the problems in the United Kingdom of diversifying, rebalancing our economy. For Russia, it's even more difficult. But one thing that Russian history tells us is that we should expect surprises, and that the more authoritarian the regime becomes, the more surprised the rulers are by what the people do on the streets. 1989, 1962, in 1953, even in the Gulag, there were revolts that had to be put down by the army. There were revolts in the Gulag in 1945. The Baltic states incorporated into the USSR conducted a guerrilla war for years thereafter. In the 1930s, there were even street demonstrations against Stalin in the early 1930s. In 1920 to 1921, communism was nearly overthrown. Tsarism was overthrown after a failed revolution in 1905 to 1906. Then came the successful one in 1917. We should not be surprised if we are surprised in the near or medium or long-term future.
Question from Duncan is about, I mentioned Ulukhaev. Yes, it's an elite conflict, certainly. And it is certainly Sechin who's behind that. And this goes, but this is rather a deep-rooted elite conflict. It goes back to Medvedev and Sechin. Remember that they were together way back in the early 90s in St. Petersburg. Medvedev was Putin's lawyer on the International Trade Committee, and Sechin was Putin's secretary. And fast forward to 2003 or so, and Sechin is with Rosneft, I forget the exact position, Medvedev's with Gazprom. Putin tries to bring them together, tries to have Gazprom take over Rosneft, and it doesn't work. Sechin rebels against it. And Gazprom and Rosneft become rival political gangs. When Medvedev's president, he moves against Sechin and stops Sechin from being both a minister, actually deputy prime minister, wasn't it? And at the same time being head of Rosneft. So there's this long-running conflict within the elite, which comes to the fore with Ulukhaev, because Ulukhaev is one of Medvedev's ministers. And the point, I think, is that Putin, you're right to say, Putin tries to stay away from it. Of course, he couldn't stay away from it. In fact, when he was asked, he said that when he was asked about it, people pointed out that Sechin had been condemned by the magistrate, not the magistrate, what's the word, the judge, sorry, for not turning up 4 times to the trial. And Putin said, well, yes, he could have turned up. But it shows the extent to which the Siloviki controlled the courts, that it was Sechin's side that was able to win. But the point I'm trying to make is, on the one hand, yes, it is a elite conflict, but it shouldn't come out into the open like that. They shouldn't be fighting each other like this. The previous time this happened was 2007, when in the run-up to the presidential election, before it had even been decided who would succeed Putin or whether Putin would go on, different security services began to attack each other about about their own roles, and that was a time when Putin was scared about a coloured revolution coming inside Russia itself. So you're right, it's an elite conflict, but I'm trying to say it's something that's dangerous for the regime, and the fact that Putin allowed Ulukhaev to be sent down to prison shows that he was backing that side against Medvedev.
I think I cannot imagine a scenario, and I could be wrong, but I cannot imagine a scenario in which you can remove a sitting minister in handcuffs, right, without the approval of the head of state, right? So Putin, now whether his hand was forced is another question, right? Obviously, the things that Pete was talking about are happening and have been happening. But I think there is more of a strategic element to this, and it gets into your question about how elites realign. Given that, what happens, politics begins on the 19th of March, right? When we then begin a 6-year conversation about what happens in 2024, right? The same way we had when Putin came up for his last end of constitutional sort of legitimacy, right? So there will be, I think, a very similar, if we can use the past as a predictor, a very similar process of trying to keep people off balance, trying to keep people guessing, trying to make it very difficult for elites to come together in coalitions that could possibly bind Putin's hand ahead of time, right? And so creating the kind of uncertainty that going after somebody like Ulukhaev creates, right, actually I think plays very well into that sort of unbalancing kind of strategy. You want to keep everybody focused on you. You want to make it very difficult for anybody to build any reasonable predictions about the future.
He's a lawyer by training. He's very intelligent. He's also very charismatic, and that's how he became this kind of leader. And he led thousands of people. And he's since become a very intriguing character. He uses YouTube and talks about the corruption of the elites. And it was actually very clever because so many of Putin's admirers, a lot of them are sort of older women who kind of look at him and they think, well, he's a strong man, he doesn't drink, and he's bringing Russia up from its knees after we lost the Soviet Union. But like when you take the angle of corruption, there's not that much you can argue about. I mean, you can really like Putin the man, but if you say, well, you're not getting your pension, but like look at Medvedev's dacha. Like, why do Putin's cronies have a £500,000 watch? Why do they have a £3 million house in Greece or Cyprus or wherever? And so these kind of questions are quite hard to answer. So the fact that he's gone down the corruption route, it was actually a very smart move. I mean, he's also very aggressively nationalistic. There are lots of parts of his agenda and thinking that I don't agree with at all, but as a character, I think he is definitely very interesting. He's obviously tried to run in the election this year. Him and everyone else, everyone knows that he would never become president this year, but he is really playing the long game, because if it's not 2024, in 20, 30 years, once Putin dies or for whatever reason steps down, there will be a political vacuum in Russia, and the country will really be brought to its knees. And at that point, Navalny will be there. He'll be a name that people know about, and he'll be someone who he can sort of fill the void. And so I think he's playing the long game.
Just to add that the nationalist tinge that Navalny sometimes has, one of the sort of almost harangues I watched him put out was that, we really ought to get the money from the West in here, into Russia, but we really don't want those migrant labourers from Central Asia. And, he does come out with statements like that on occasion.
Why is Navalny serious opposition? His videos showing the corruption among the elite are very widely seen in Russia. Navalny's, Michal, yes? I was asking about the policy of Navalny to boycott the elections. He hadn't been allowed to stand, and therefore he was boycotting. Ksenia Sobchak, on the other one, says the other opposites. Because I am allowed to stand, therefore I am standing, and people please vote for me against everyone. Hodorkovsky's had an interesting view on this. Mikhail Hodorkovsky, the former, I shouldn't say former, he's still pretty wealthy, but not powerful in the sense of being an oligarch in that sense, has said that people actually should carry on and vote for some opposition candidate. And he considers opposition Sobchak, Greene, the communist, or Yadinsky. And it's because this is a way in which people can show their civic participation, so long as they're voting against Putin. And this actually recalls Navalny's position, which was very successful in the 2011 State Duma elections, when he said vote against everyone vote for anyone except United Russia. And that was what led to such a big vote so they couldn't cover it up, that United Russia had done really badly because of that policy of participation. So I do see on this, I don't agree, by no means, I don't agree with Khodorkovsky's on everything. I certainly don't agree with the way he amassed his billions. But I tend, I must admit, towards Khodorkovsky rather than to Navalny's position. But, main point, I don't think I should be telling Russians what to do on that. That's my main point on that.
Navalny, an interesting point about Navalny, because it was actually very recently that Baburin said he might give Navalny a post. Did anyone else see this? At gubernatorial level. That's in the last 2-3 days, I recall seeing that. Navalny also, another point, one argument is that really he's been sidelined to a certain extent. He hasn't quite been made a martyr at all by the regime, but he's inevitably out there. And Khodorkovsky's message is, look forward to 2024. And he takes a more evolutionary perspective on this. And also I think the comment, Pete, I don't know if you saw this, that actually Navalny may not change things radically, or not able to, but we will see.
Lastly, on Navalny's Zabastovka, I think this is actually quite a almost an ingenious thing to have done, right? Not being allowed to run, right? He doesn't have to. I'll back up a step. We heard earlier this evening about this sort of 70-70 target that the Kremlin and Kirienko had set for the campaign. 70% turnout, 70% result for Putin. After the Duma elections, right, what we were hearing from the presidential administration was they were just going to go for one of those 70s, right? So they wanted to get the 70% result, but they could probably live without the 70% turnout. As soon as Navalny said, I'm going to campaign for a boycott, right? The 70-70 came back, right? It forced the Kremlin into campaigning again to get maximum turnout, right? So if they get anything appreciably lower than 70%, or if it looks like they had to falsify a bit too much in order to get to the 70%, that will look like a moral victory for Navalny. So it's forcing really a lot of this attention that we're seeing. People are going door to door, canvassing, putting things up. I'm getting, on Facebook, I'm getting, information from the Russian embassy that I should go and vote, which would probably not make the Russian embassy very happy. But so they're spending resources in ways that they were not initially intending to, and I think that is down to that strategy.
Russian Orthodox Church should be understood to be an actor. The mistake of some analysts and some journalists is to see Russian Orthodox Church simply as a puppet of the state. They are actually an actor pushing their own ideology, and they've come into conflict with Putin over the level of, in the past, over the level of religious education, where Putin and the state actually resisted the Orthodox Church's attempts to make religious education, meaning a course on orthodoxy, in favour of orthodoxy, compulsory in the schools.
The church, it's mainly Baburin who has been talking a lot about orthodoxy, Russian revival, that notion of Russian revival, Russian culture, Russian tradition, that's very much his narrative, his script, and also looking back to the Soviet Union and what it stood for, sort of good Russian values.
The Russian Orthodox Church is important in as much as it's necessary for the construction of the kind of national myth that contemporary Russia is seeking to build for its people, for the Russian people. And there is always a cost. If you use agencies to build your myth, those agencies acquire an importance and a weight that you perhaps don't want them to have in relation to yourself, you, the leader. That's happening with the security agencies, and it's happening with the ecclesiastical agencies. That's the problem of running an authoritarian administration. It's not so easy as it should be.
are we scared for our lives? Well, I think our role is really not to threaten Russia, but to understand it. And everyone on this panel has a fascination with it. It's where we're coming from. I don't think Putin should be afraid of us.
If any of us on this panel, myself included, have anything to fear from the Kremlin, things are a lot worse for Putin than we think.
Am I afraid?
Are you scared?
Am I scared, Sasha? I will be going to Russia next year.
The obvious lesson was that the Kremlin took things too much for granted and kind of gifted the opposition the narrative, but recovered in some ways, overreacted in time for victory in the presidential election in 2012. So this time they've been much tougher with their attempts to marginalise opposition voices. But one of the interesting things about your presentation in particular is that Navalny's narrative is out there, even though he isn't. Right? So he may be marginalised, but his narrative isn't excluded from the general background. Social media. I've seen one or two attempts to reach out to younger audiences on social media. There's this clip, these two people are dating and it's all broken off because the guy hasn't voted. Social media actually, the Kremlin has done many things, of course, to kind of increase its influence on social media. But it's probably a better instrument for the Kremlin's modus operandi abroad, right? Which is to play divide and rule, to find disaffected groups and amplify their voice, to find controversies and throw petrol on them. Whereas traditionally dramaturgia is about mainstream voice, if you like, and it's easiest to create that kind of majority mainstream consensus via TV. TV is also a very powerful instrument. It's emotive, it's visual. If you want a particularly dramaturgia. So that is an open and interesting question. That TV is better for the Kremlin at home, and social media probably better than abroad.
Nadia, do you agree?
Yeah. So I will answer your question. As I said, I don't think the Kremlin, they use state media very aggressively. It's a very obvious message that they put out. So, for example, Dmitry Kiselov, who is the kind of chief propagandist of the Kremlin, he's on Channel 1, and he'll say such incredibly inflammatory things like he's so homophobic that he said that all the hearts of gay men should be burned and they shouldn't get a funeral, they shouldn't get a proper funeral. So these are like the most aggressive, abhorrent kind of statements you can imagine. That doesn't really wash with the younger people. But that's not to say that the Kremlin aren't able to manipulate social media. So, for example, Nadia, which is the pro-Kremlin youth organisation which is set up by Surkov, they are all over social media. And so they can post certain things, they can contribute to debates, and stimulate a kind of aggressive conversation. Also, I think with a very conservative Ministry of Culture, most films will get their funding through the Ministry of Culture. And it's happened time and time again in the last few years, increasingly more so, that films or directors will apply for funding, and if the Ministry of Culture deem the film to be not upholding traditional values or to be in some way anti-Russia, they won't give them money for the film. So Zvyagintsev film Leviathan, which came out 3 or 4 years, obviously that he was mainly financed by the Ministry of Culture, and the film came out at a turning point in Russia. It was 2014, I think, if I remember correctly. And the film, I think, is actually quite anti-Russia, and so there was a big row, and Medinsky who was the culture minister, wanted to ban the film. His latest film, Loveless, got no funding through the Ministry of Culture, and so in the last 3 years, we've actually seen a real tightening and in that sphere. And so these are the films that young people are watching. And so if more and more the space for independent narratives and films decreases, then there is only space left for a kind of pro-Kremlin traditional culture.
On the point of political oppositionists and the elimination of them in successive elections, it is a problem. While the future isn't predictable, it is definitely difficult to see how an organised perivarot could take place without leadership, because after all, before 1917, the underground political parties were small in the number of followers that they had, but they were well organised, and they had a tradition of organisation which they had preserved. And Putin has gone after this, tried to prevent this recurring, so that someone who comes out of nothing, like Navalny, is going to be more difficult to replicate in the years ahead, because Putin has seen how a Navalny can self-create.
This question has been posed for so long now. How long can he stay? The idea that he's really very weak. He's still there. And one recent image of him is actually sitting in the chair where Putin is usually sitting, interviewing somebody. And now, in the last week, I've seen Medvedev sort of packaged that way at least twice. Does he really need to go, is the question. Kudrin is always a name that is thrown out as a possible, and others. I really wouldn't want to speculate on who.
I think that relates to what we think about the Putin administration generally, and I think it's wrong to overstate its monolithic qualities. And although he's lent increasingly towards the Siloviki over the years, and although he lost Finance Minister Alexei Kudrin in 2011, nevertheless he still appears in public with Kudrin, and he still plays with the idea, or at least allows the idea, of an alternative economic and social strategy for contemporary Russia. There is still a debate, a very intense debate going on inside the Putin administration. So I don't think we can easily predict how that will play out. We can't be sure that what we're going to get is just more of the same after the election.
There was a rumour going around that Medvedev, part of the deal whereby Medvedev agreed that Putin would become the presidential candidate in 2012, was that Putin promised him he would be prime minister for the 4-year term. It was only for the 4-year term. I think, though, that it might be dangerous for Putin to remove Medvedev, in the sense that there are precedents. I think it was Bob who mentioned Kasyanov, former prime minister who turns into opposition. From Ukraine, there are even more worrying cases, Yushchenko after Kuchma in particular. So it is a risk for Putin to get rid of Medvedev, I'd suggest to you. It's better, I'd have thought, to keep him there, reducing his power. But I may be wrong, the Kudrin I saw last year in Moscow, and he was talking about his reform program, and how Putin was considering it. And somebody asked him, well, but is your program going to implement it? And Kudrin said, I don't know. So there's much uncertainty in Moscow.
America, that's a very interesting question. What does the elite, the ruling elite, feel about America? Well, one thing they feel about America is that they hate the place. They absolutely abhor the place. I've spent the last year reading the online speeches and statements of Putin and his associates, and it's the one country that is really the object of a national leadership obsession. There's almost nothing said very seriously at length about the other superpower in the world, namely China. There's a sort of blanket ban about not saying anything nasty about the Chinese, and yet all of you who've been to Russia recently know that when you have private conversations, the long-term threat is not just the American one to the Russian popular mind, it's also the Chinese one, and that's been a longer threat in terms of centuries, the threat from the East, than anything from America. They're schizophrenic about it, because they also, at the same time as hating America, they use Apple iPhones. They listen to rock music, which, even if it's not directly American or British, is the product of the kind of music that was around here in the 50s, 60s and 70s. So that their culture is very, very heavily impregnated with an admiration for the West. They're schizophrenic about it. They haven't yet properly made up their mind. Why are they sending so many of their kids to English public schools? Why is so much Russian financial capital invested in the city of London? Actually, this is a problem that our own government ought to address when it's dealing with the matter of the Salisbury assassination attempt a few days ago. Why is our government so supine? Why did it take 9 years for an inquiry to be initiated, a judicial inquiry to be initiated into the assassination of Alexander Litvinenko?
The USA, the Levada polls, and you know that over time you can see Russian reactions to the USA, following on from what Bob has just said, and these fluctuate according, obviously, to context and what's been going on.
For the first time, I think, in the entirety of post-Soviet history, albeit not that long, the US will probably not intervene in the Russian election. So at least there's that to look forward to.
In a certain sense, the US has intervened, I have to say. I mean, ever since the 2014 sanctions, really, whether it's Obama, and those sanctions have continued against Russia under Trump, despite what Trump wanted. I think, I'm sorry to disagree with some of it here, but I think they don't like the sanctions. I mean, some of the sanctions might have helped them to develop indigenous agriculture and possibly the defense industry. But they don't like the sanctions that are targeted against Putin and Putin's cronies and the top people, the oligarchs and Siloviki, because it makes it harder to raise money in London or abroad in New York, and it makes it harder for them to come here, and it interferes with their financial transactions in general.
Well, the elites linking across the world, again, you would really have to do lots of polls with the people concerned to know the extent to which they are linked. But inevitably, everyone coming to be studied in the West, within the elite and going back, is what Yevgenia Albats would argue is a possibility in the sense that even though many of them will be the sons and daughters of the Siloviki, they may pick up different values. Now, McMafia suggests otherwise, but again, that's something to debate. And it's very hard to be precise without doing the research. And one further comment, and my last comment on doing research, what I would really love to see is, some top Russian social scientists doing focus groups with Russian voters across age groups, because no age group is homogeneous. Russians do not all think alike. I think there are far more nuances in Russian reactions to these elections than we can know sitting here reading the press. You know, you need to get into there and talk to people and pose questions and get sort of rich texture of qualitative data.
Sounds like some of the research that Sam's been doing. So
Well, I mean, on that point specifically, right? I mean, so Dmitriev and Milanovsky were running those sorts of focus groups ahead of the 2011-2012 elections. They showed very clearly that United Russia was not going to get what they thought they were going to get. People like that are doing those, but there's a reason they're not publishing them at the moment. Going back to other questions that were asked. On elites and conflict and the potential to use conflict or aggressive, whatever, foreign policy to consolidate elites, I don't think it's a question of consolidating elites. I think that what conflict has done very well has been to marginalize them and to bind them. It's made the elites it's made the elite less of a ruling elite and more subservient. The fact that all finance, right, for major Russian corporations and for even regional governments has to run, rather than going directly to international financial markets, has to run either through the finance ministry or through the central bank, gives the Kremlin leverage over the elite that it has never had before. And very clearly, the Russian elite do not have friends around the world that can compete with the friends that they have in Moscow. That was certainly not always the case, right? So if there isn't an easy option that would allow the elite to be enfranchised and yet somehow quite docile, I would expect the Kremlin to stick with what's working at the moment, right? To stick with a level of conflict, to stick, in fact, with sanctions. Rhetorically, they don't like sanctions. I think from a political management perspective, actually, they're quite happy with sanctions as long as they don't get particularly worse. And in order really to keep the elite, again, in line ahead of what will be the 2024 decision to come.
I tried to say in my remarks that we don't know whether the current lack of dramaturgia is a short-term or a long-term thing, whether it's a strategic recalculation or the calm before a renewed storm. There are scenarios in which the latter could happen. The economy is in a low growth track. The use of this kind of aggressive dramaturgy is kind of ingrained, but also it's the kind of key to power in Russia. So if Putin is fading away and there is a struggle for power around him, it will be a struggle for narrative control, not so much the keys to the Kremlin as the keys to MTV, maybe. So yes, it might happen.
And the elites reconfiguring, it's very hard to predict these things because we know from the philosophy of science that even in the natural sciences, unless you have perfect knowledge and can value every variable, you actually can't predict. At best you have rule of thumb and probabilistic explanation. The same applies here. There is so much that we cannot always anticipate. We can merely hypothesize in terms of probability. So who knows?
Of what is the morale of the ruling elite, and I would say at the moment they're nothing like as demoralized as the communist ruling elite was becoming in the early 1980s, which eventually gave Gorbachev his opportunity to attempt the reform of the USSR. We're not talking about an elite that is feeling that the path that it chose for Russia in the early 2000s was completely mistaken or seriously defective. It's more like the elite of 1945 to 1946. We won the war. Now let's make this system win the peace.
And finally, on Yuri's very interesting point, I'm afraid that after the election, there will be a crackdown by Putin domestically. I mean, that will be even worse than what we've had before. I'm not sure I'd like to be Ksenia Sobchak. I don't think she is going to become governor of anywhere, although I know you weren't saying that she would be, that this was her plan, but I'd certainly rule that out. I'd rather think she's going the other sort of way. Actually, the Belarusian model of 2010 would come to mind, where Lukashenko put several of his opponents in prison. But on the international scale, even though they would like the sanctions removed, Putin is stuck into it now. And the attempted assassination of Skripal is highly indicative. But just in this very room last month, I was complaining about the British government in the same way as Bob just has. I'm very glad to have your support on that, on the British government not investigating these the 14 crimes that the 14 suspected murders that BuzzFeed has been reporting. I was very glad that Yvette Cooper, who is now the chairperson of the House of Commons Home Affairs Select Committee, is asking in Parliament about these issues. And forcing the Conservative government, I think, now probably to take a stronger response. But probably because the Skripal thing was actually so public, the way that it was conducted, that people were found in public, not in somebody's house, and clearly no possibility of suicide, which means that there has to be a stronger reaction. And I think it will be stronger now than with Litvinenko. And the question is really, to what extent Britain's allies in NATO and our former partners, or still partners actually, in the European Union, will back up Britain. The attempts on Skripal are to, in the context of the Russian election, to frighten the opposition and to get pride from his support base in Russia's power.
Putin did not need Skripal or this story or anything to win the election, right? So the idea that this would have been done for electoral purposes strikes me as nothing short of preposterous. There could be lots of other reasons why we want to do it, but I mean, at this point, dangerous talking about tea leaves when we're talking about these stories, but we're reading tea leaves and really nothing else. Expectations, I would come back to this sense that really, the question was here, right? What Putin is after is trying to allow everybody to imagine that every possible future is out there, right? So if you come back to sort of the tandem, right, that would be the ideal situation for Putin. At that point in time, if you wanted a modernizing, liberalizing country, you could support the Medvedev project, right? And if you wanted a conservative, statist, sort of great power project, you could support Putin, right? And at the end of the day, you were supporting the same darn thing, so it works really well for them. The question is going to be whether Putin can generate an encompassing narrative, right, that can hold for the next 6 years and allow people to have a stake in whatever future is going to come after 2024. It's going to be a very neat trick if he can pull it off.
Thank you.